Hi, everybody. My name's Walsh. We're just allowing people in the room at the moment. Whilst we're doing this, if anybody would like to use the chat function, I should try and keep an eye on the chat function during this window. Please do introduce yourself in the chat function. Say who you are and where it is that you're from, because I know people usually find that interesting. I always find it interesting finding out where people have come from. So please do. KEYSTONE, excellent, good. We got somebody there who's made a start and put something in. Please do use the chat function. Introduce yourself. We're waiting for more people to arrive, more people to come into the room. We're just gone 4 o'clock. KEYSTONE, excellent. Welcome, KEYSTONE. Pleased to have you along in this session here. Folkestone School for Girls. Okay, super. KEYSTONE, what's the weather like in your neck of the woods? I'm down in Cornwall, and it's been rather variable, but it's actually quite nice at the moment. But it's always interesting to find out what the weather is like, where other people are. So do let me know, and other people, please do introduce yourself on this. We'll just give opportunity for people to sign in. Currently raining and very quiet. Oh dear. Okay, well, it's been quite a variable day down here in Cornwall. So we've had some scattered showers, and it looks like it's about to start showering again. But when the sunshine breaks through, it's been absolutely lovely. So hopefully this weather is going to be headed your way as well. Anybody else would like to introduce themselves? We will make a start on the session in a moment. I'm very conscious of the fact with running a session at this time of day, that of course people are just coming out of very often people just coming out of the classroom, probably grabbing a cup of tea and getting themselves ready for a session here. Okay, right. It's 3 minutes past 4, so I think we will make a start at this point here. Thank you very much indeed for joining us for this session. My name's Walsh. I'm one of the authors who has worked on Key Stage 3 Science now, and this is the book I've got a copy of here, and it may well be that a number of you either have copies of this book, or you're considering it, or you've seen some flyers and you want to know a little bit more about it. So I have a slide deck here which will make a start on running there. So you should now be able to see that. So you should have a title screen there, Rethinking Key Stage 3. And as I said, what I will try and do as well is to keep my eye on the chat window. What I always say when I'm doing sessions like this is, please do feel free at any point to pitch in with comments or questions or points that you want to raise. There are a couple of points where I'll be asking you for ideas, for comments and suggestions, so please do. The idea of a session like this is supposed to be one that we get people participating in, so I hope that's going to happen with this. But also, if there are other questions that you want to ask, then please do put those in the chat function as well. I'll try and keep my eye on this window. When I see something come up, I'll make a decision at that point there, either to deal with it straight away, or whether, and maybe this is a slightly broader question, then it might well be that I come back to it at some convenient pause in the session. But as I said, I'm really keen on you feeling that you have the opportunity to raise anything that you want to here. So let's make a start on this then. So as I said, my name's Walsh. I've been working on various different publications, mainly, but not entirely to do with Science for Commons for quite a few years now. I was a classroom teacher for 20 years. For 12 of those, I was head of department. I still think in some ways that running a science department, I never was never kind of looking for a way out of doing that, although I found it very busy, very hectic, very full on, and very exhausting. It was still one of those things that I really got a kick out of doing. The kind of work that I do now, having been a teacher for 20 years, I then went to work for the local authority in Cornwall, and then worked for a number of other organisations, including the National Strategies. I finished with the local authority 7 years ago and work as an independent consultant now. And quite a large part of what I do is to do with working on a range of different publications, and there's a few of those that I put up there. Key Stage 3 Science now, obviously that's one that you would expect me to have. That's one that we finished working on a couple of months back, and of course it's now published, both the student book and the teacher guide. Prior to that, there was the Key Stage 3 Science Lab book, which is one that I worked on, and I'll be using a couple of ideas from that when I'm explaining a little bit about the way that we approach the development of Key Stage 3 Science now. The other one that you see there, top right, this was another Commons publication. This was a revision guide that I did some work on. This was an overhaul of a previous title that we wanted to bring up to date and current and relevant. And so I spent quite a bit of time working on, well, in my case, it was the physics part of that. And one of the things that was interesting with this was just kind of thinking through, and this is something I'll be coming back to, knowing what we now know about GCSE, what are the kind of questions that should be coming up at Key Stage 3. One of the things that I quite often say to groups of teachers, if I was still a head of department, one of the things that I would be very keen to pose as a question is my Key Stage 3 course doing its job? Because I think it's difficult, not impossible, but I think it's difficult to get really good results, to get pupils to make really good progress in the Key Stage 4 course if the Key Stage 3 course isn't functioning well. So that's really going to be quite a big part of what it is that we're talking about. The other publication, which you see the front cover of here, which is not a Commons publication, but it's one that was also a very interesting experience working on it. This is a program for the ASE, and this built on a report that came out a few years ago, which was called Good Practical Science. I'm sure many of you will have seen the report called Good Practical Science. It's an excellent report. It came out, gosh, 6 years ago now. If you've not seen a copy of it, if you just Google Good Practical Science, pretty quickly you'll get to a point where you can freely download a copy of the report. And what this does is to identify, if you're serious about making a good job of practical work, if you want it to be impactful as well as engaging, what are the kind of things that you can do? And I was involved with a follow-up project with the ASE where we were looking at this and saying, okay, if you're serious about practical work in your science lessons, what's a good way of doing it? I also have involvement with a number of other organizations, including AQA. I do quite a bit of training for that exam board. I also do quite a bit of work for the National STEM Learning Centre as well. So anyway, let's move on a little bit. The purpose of this session here is, looking back now, the programme of study that many schools use, whether they're local authority schools or not, but the programme of study that many schools use, it came out, it's quite a funny thought, it came out 9 years ago. Okay, it was 2014 that the programme of study that we're using at the moment came out. And of course, when it came out, that was prior to the current GCSE specifications. Okay, at the time when it came out, we knew that the GCSE specifications were changing, but we didn't know what they were changing to. We didn't know what the new specs would look like. And so therefore, we were putting together lessons, we were designing schemes of learning. At Collins, as with other publishers, we were developing publications, and there was this slight air of, okay, we know what's in the programme study. We don't know quite what it is that we're preparing students for. Okay, so one of the things that I think is really interesting. This is the first of the questions that I'm going to put to you. Okay, so I hope people are poised, ready to answer. At this point here, really would like some feedback at this point here. Knowing what we now know, okay, here's your question. Knowing what we now know about GCSEs, what are you looking for from a good Key Stage 3 course? And I don't just mean the books, but I mean, thinking about what's going on in lessons, the kind of thing that students are learning about. There's a number of possible ideas here. Just have a couple of, just a bit of think about that, and then pitch an idea in the chat function there. What do you think should be included in a good Key Stage 3 course to make sure that your students are then ready for the GCSE course that they're then leading on to? Okay, I'm just going to pause for for a tick, please do pitch some ideas there in the chat function. What do you want to be happening in a Key Stage 3 course to get your students ready for their GCSE course? Any ideas? Please do pitch those ideas in and share those in the chat function now. Enthusiasm, excellent response, Martha. Yes, absolutely. You would want things there to be going on that would get students keen and enthusiastic. What's going to be the kind of thing that you can do there that's going to get pupils engaged and thinking that science is for them? Another excellent idea. Thank you very much indeed. The basics being well understood. What I sometimes refer to as cornerstone concepts. Okay, those fundamental ideas there are making sure that we're establishing good foundations. Sandra, thanks very much indeed. Development of higher order thinking. Okay, so we don't just want it, although they're basic ideas, we also want students to be capable of developing higher order thinking, because the difficulty is if they're not doing that in Key Stage 3, and we then ask them to do that in GCSE, they're not used to thinking in those ways. So using things like, for example, more challenging learning, the STEM to learning objectives and so on and so forth there, that's going to be really important as well. Another great response there, thanks very much indeed, enjoyment. Okay, do we want students to be enjoying the course as well? Okay, so there are a number of things that I think are really important. Thank you very much indeed for those ideas there. Quite a few things there which are going to be really important. When we were in the process of developing these materials, this is the kind of thing that we went through. We were kind of thinking there that what do we want to be in a course like this, so that it really it builds good foundations at Key Stage 3 for students then going on to GCSE. So let's have a little look then about what some of these ideas are. Now, this is not an exclusive list, but this is the kind of thing that we were coming up with, the kind of thing that we felt was important here. So one of the things that we're very keen on doing is saying, how do we make sure that a Key Stage 3 course, how do we make sure that this will get students GCSE ready? Okay, what are the kind of components of this? And one of the things that we came up with was this notion here of cornerstone concepts, all right, or keystone concepts, if you like, these fundamental ideas, and you want these to be developed in Key Stage 3 so that you can then build on them at GCSE. What we also thought was important as well was students having a bit of a roadmap. Okay, I think it's a bit disconcerting for students if each lesson or if each topic seems to be a little bit isolated, a little bit of a one-off topic, and students are going from one lesson to another or one topic to another, not quite sure where it's going. And that's not to say that the students doubt that the teachers are capable of planning, but actually for the students themselves to have a little bit of a sense, okay, so where is this leading to? Okay, many students will know, of course, that science is a core subject, that they will be doing science at least up until the age of 16, but having a bit of a sense of an overall roadmap there. Engaging starter activities, and this is really building upon a couple of the things there that have been mentioned here, trying to build on the idea that science is fun, science is engaging, science is enthusiastic. And one of the things that was interesting, when I ran this session at the ASE conference last month in Sheffield, and I was asking people for ideas about starter activities, and some of the people were coming up with really quite interesting and engaging ideas. But some of the other people there were saying, well, actually, this is one of the things that they were struggling for a little bit, that they wanted some ideas that were going to be engaging and fun and that would make the students sit up and take notes. Another of the things that we felt was important in the mix there is the role of maths. Okay, that the relationship between maths and science is a very strong relationship. It's a relationship that goes back a long way. And of course, what we know from the GCSE specs is that the role of maths has been strengthened even further than it had been previously. My background is as a physics teacher. Maths has always had a strong role in physics. But the GCSE specs that came out in 2016, they also posited a strong role for maths as well in chemistry. It's always been there to a certain extent, but it strengthened that, and in biology as well. So we felt it was important here And one of the things that I would say, whenever I'm working with schools doing any kind of school review or anything like this, one of the questions I'm always keen on asking is, what is the relationship like with the maths team? Because there are some schools that I visited or had Zoom conference calls with where they say, oh, we work very closely with the maths department, and then others where that kind of relationship is not there in place, and you kind of think, well, okay, that's going to make life a little bit harder at that point there. Future opportunities. Okay, what are the kind of, if you're good at science, what are the kind of opportunities that are open for you? Okay, so it's a way of saying, okay, if you're good at chemistry, you can go on and you can be a chemist. But of course, we know that there are far more opportunities, far wider opportunities than that. So one of the things that we're very keen on doing is saying, well, actually, what are some of those opportunities? Because as science teachers, we don't necessarily know what all of those opportunities are. And so therefore, it seemed to us that actually quite a useful function of a set of teaching resources is to actually flag some of these things up, and hopefully that some of these will start to spark a bit of interest and spark a bit of a response there, and maybe even some students go away and they start googling ideas or following up links to things because they'd not quite realized that was something that they might go into, something that might be something that would present some future opportunity for interest or training or employment. Terminology. Keywords, fundamentally important, this role of keywords, and if students are not inducted in this in Key Stage 3, if their technical terminology isn't strengthened at that point they're going to be on the back foot at GCSE. So we thought that was really important as well. What's also important is having practice questions and to have a wide range of different kinds of questions there, not only straight recall questions. Okay, do we want people to see science as being something which is accessible, but is also quite challenging as well? And we also wanted to give students worked examples. This is not the total list, but as you would expect, that there were some worked examples there as well. Okay, so this was the kind of agenda that we saw, and we felt that since 2014, if you like, that the debate had moved on it a little bit, so the role of these things, that we knew a little bit more, the teachers were looking for a little bit more here, so that these were the kind of things that we wanted to reflect here. So this notion of Key Stage 3 as a preparation for GCSE. So the kind of questions that we asked to teachers, we were asking teachers questions like, which of the things do you find harder to cover? Which are the kind of things that you feel that there should be more material on? What do students express difficulty with? Because that's not automatically the same thing there. What does your tracking data show? Okay, you might think that something is fairly straightforward to teach and you can explain it to students, okay, but actually, what does your tracking data show that students struggle with? Because sometimes students come unstuck on some fairly basic ideas. Maybe that's because those ideas were included right at the start of year 7 and then not revisited. And what does our analysis of summative assessment data indicate? Okay, if you do any kind of end of year exam or end of Key Stage 3 exam, then what does that indicate there? And what can we learn from examiners' reports? Okay, so the kind of things, when we look at the examiners' reports at the end of GCSE, what are the kind of things that we can pick up from that? So these were the kind of things that we were drawing upon here and kind of saying, okay, now some of those things are really best dealt with at GCSE, but actually some of these other things here, we need to start the ball rolling at Key Stage 3. So let's start to have a look at some of these features. If you've already got hold of a copy of Key Stage 3 Science now, or even better, if you bought class sets of these, some of these features that you will recognize here. One of the things we're very keen on doing is saying, okay, so what is this kind of GCSE content? What are these important ideas that are going on here? And what is the prequel? Okay, what is the prequel at Key Stage 3? So, for example, the first one there in the list, I make no apologies for being ex-physics teacher, Newton's laws of motion. Okay, now that's fair and square GCSE. But what do we want students to have covered at Key Stage 3? Well, actually, I'd argue quite strongly that if students have met ideas about balanced and unbalanced forces, and if they really understood what we mean by that, and they can apply that to a range of different contexts, as a physics teacher, I would then feel more confident with those students going into GCSE, looking at some fairly crunchy stuff in terms of GCSE physics or the physics part of combined science, knowing that I got some firm foundations there. And other examples there, those were some of the things. Over on the right-hand side there, an increasing number of schools now making good use of knowledge organisers. Okay, and one of the things that I'd like you to do at this point, please, is just to pitch in the chat function. It may well be that you've used knowledge organisers, maybe the ones that you've written yourself, you've got from elsewhere, or you've used from Commons Key Stage 3 Science now. I'd like you to share ideas, please. How do you use knowledge organisers? Or if you're not using them at the moment, how would you want to make use of knowledge organisers? Okay, why do you think that these are things which are of value and which students find useful? Okay, so I'm going to catch breath for a minute. If I could ask you to pitch in the chat function there. Okay, the function of knowledge organisers. What's the value of these? So look and see the kind of ideas that people are coming up with there. How would you hope and expect students to make use of these, or perhaps teachers making use of these? Okay, so in terms of revising, thank you, Martha, a sense of revision there. So if you've got some kind of periodic or summative assessment or an end of topic test or something like that, it's something that you can point students towards. And also making this very good point here about vocabulary. Okay, and this idea of vocabulary and strengthening vocabulary, repeating access to vocabulary, so that students are they have a further opportunity to see how that vocabulary is being used technically. Okay, and we know that teachers make quite a bit of use of knowledge organisers, and so therefore we wanted to make sure that we'd included these, these in Key Stage 3 Science now. These appear at fairly regular intervals. Okay, so these are the kind of things there that are put in front of students and the students can access and use in various different ways. So let's have a look at what else it is that is also included here. Now, you remember what I said earlier about the importance of having a roadmap of learning and students getting a sense of actually, where does this go to? All right, we're doing some stuff, for example, here on, I don't know, it might be something to do with particles. Why are we learning about particles? Where does this go? So what we do here at the start of each of the chapters is that we put in a roadmap which shows how these ideas link. And it's not only how the ideas link within the topic at Key Stage 3, but also how they build on ideas from Key Stage 2. Now, of course, in some cases, there isn't anything at Key Stage 2 that students will have been doing, but in quite a few cases that there is. So, for example, with this one here, in terms of cells, now students may well not have studied cells prior to Key Stage 3, but that doesn't mean they won't know anything about the characteristics of living things, or this notion of there being different kinds of functions in living things. And we thought it was useful to have a pretty brief summary there, so that what happens is that a teacher who is covering this topic at the start of the topic can well look at this and say, well, okay, what might my students have met previously? Maybe it's just that I wasn't very good at this. Sometimes I would ask a year 7 class, so what have you done previously around this topic? And sometimes you would get some rather blank faces here. So it's quite useful to have some nudges and prompts, because quite often what I learned is that actually if you nudge students a little bit more, then actually they would then start to recall, oh, we did do something on digestion, or we did do something on the skeleton, we did do something on joints, we did make models of joints. It seemed to be quite a common activity, out of pieces of cardboard and elastic bands and so on and so forth there. So having that there as a nudge for both teachers and students, we felt was really quite important, but also to show how that then led on to other work at Key Stage 4, so that students can see this is part of a bigger picture. So having that roadmap of learning there, we felt that was something that was really quite important. Another of the things that we thought was important as well is this idea of having a selection of starter activities. Okay, now, of course, there is a teacher guide and there are ideas there in the teacher guide, but some of these things become more manageable, more doable if there are appropriate prompts there for students as well. So we wanted to start every topic off with starter activity. Quite often it's something that's got quite a strong visual input. And we know, for example, that one of the ways in which some teachers use these, it's what our colleagues in the USA sometimes refer to as a do now. Okay, having an activity that's poised, ready for students to use when they come in the room. Okay, so that we know that in some cases that teachers will already have the textbook out, and they'll say to students, okay, turn to page such and such as you're arriving in the room, as you're settling. So I'd like you to have a go at this activity here. But of course, it's not only a case of doing something which will engage students, it's also a case of doing something as well which teachers themselves will learn something from in terms of the kind of responses that they get from students. So I'd argue quite strongly that a good starter activity is one that not only draws the student into the lesson, but also starts to produce evidence, if you like, probably rather informal evidence, but nevertheless very useful evidence for a teacher to think, okay, so how familiar are my students with this topic? Do they seem to have to be able to carry over some ideas about what we were doing last lesson, or are they a bit rusty on this? Where can I go from here? What's the kind of vocabularies that they're comfortable with using? What are the kind of ideas that they're building on? So these were the kind of things that we wanted to incorporate in the starter activities. So each of the topics has got a selection of starter activities there, and there are more ideas in the teacher guide as well. So starter activities, that was one of the things that was there. We also wanted to make sure that they were things that were a little bit upbeat and not just things that were straightforward recall from the previous lesson. The role of maths. We wanted to, wherever appropriate, to show students quite clearly how maths is used and the range of different kinds of math skills that are being used there. And so one of the ways, for example, is in terms of worked examples. So there's an example there that fairly obviously uses a math skill there in terms of yeast and the ways that yeast will reproduce, and then the application of some math skills towards saying, well, okay, so let's work out actually how many, in this case, how many yeast cells there will be after each 90-minute interval there. And of course, one of the things that's useful about this as well is that you're not only developing the strategy, but also the use of language as well. And as we know, in terms of maths, that's going to be something that's really quite important. And getting students engaging with things like this, of course, it soon starts to reveal what it is that they feel comfortable with, and also getting students to indicate about whether this is something they recognize from maths lessons, whether it's something that they've come across previously, whether it's something that they can carry across. And in a number of cases that we know that this has facilitated conversations between science teachers and maths teachers. Sometimes the science teacher assuming that something will have been done in maths or will have been done in a certain way. So another thing here, I mentioned earlier on the idea about what are the future opportunities. So one of the things here that is just flagged up, this is just one example. There are quite a selection that are included in each of the chapters. There's always one there in quite a bit of detail, and then about half a dozen others as well. They're not necessarily the kind of thing that as a teacher you would spend a huge amount of time on, but they are the kind of thing that you can draw attention to or may well catch students' eyes. And one of the things here is that we've been quite keen to say it's not just a case of saying, well, if you're interested in this, you could be, well, in this case, go on to become a pathologist, but actually drilling down a little bit and saying, why is it that this topic here includes a number of ideas and a number of skills which are directly relevant. Okay, so it's not just a possible link on a rather superficial basis. It's actually people who are good at pathology and earn quite a good living from doing something like this. They started with doing the kind of lesson that you're doing now. Okay, so this is a way in which, you know, what you're doing now has a future purpose there. And of course, if students do express an interest in this, there's a number of ways in which you can follow up on this. It may well be that you have some other pointers that you can give students, or you might well be able to access facilities such as STEM ambassadors, and so forth from that. So the idea of these sections, and these start each of the chapters here. So it's the idea of having these future pointers. What we're also keen on doing as well is flagging up the importance of key terms here. And you've got to be quite careful with this, I think, because you can overload students. And sometimes if you have too long a list, they can be a little bit off-putting if students are not too comfortable with using technical terminology. But on the other hand, you do want to make sure that you're giving students proper access. So we didn't put words in this list unless they were words that were actually used and the students needed to use during this topic. But what we wanted to do as well was to give students the opportunity to actually have an accessible definition of those. And the idea here was not only to provide students with a resource that they could access themselves, but also to make it easier for teachers to do vocabulary-based activities. Okay, so if there are things that you wanted to do, if you've got reason to believe, for example, that some of your students are not so good at developing the use of technical terminology here, well, you've got a clear structure here. And of course, a number of these terms are the kind of things that, you know, they come up at Key Stage 3. Of course, many of these are coming up at GCSE as well. So it's worthwhile doing a bit of front loading on this. And what we know as well is that teachers will use these resources in a variety of different ways. So, for example, one of the ways in which teachers have used these is in terms of flashcards. So, you know, and you've got a basis there for doing that. You've got a whole load of words that you know are key words there. And in terms of making flashcards, quite possibly laminating those flashcards. Another thing that you can do is, for example, to ask a question, particularly a higher order question, and then say to students, and when you answer, I want you to make sure that you're making good use of appropriate keywords with this. Don't offer me an answer unless it's got the appropriate technical terminology in there. And some teachers have taken to displaying these in a variety of different ways. So they're there very much as a resource that can be dipped into and can be used on different ways, depending upon where your students are coming from, what their level of expertise is. One final comment I would make on this: I know sometimes, having been a teacher for 20 years, I know it can be quite frustrating if students don't, you know, seem to be a little bit lax with their use of technical terminology. And sometimes there's a bit of a risk that what happens is that you kind of say, okay, we're really going to have to focus upon this. We've got a whole list of words here. We've got to learn the meaning of these words. What the research shows very much is that actually focusing upon just a handful of these at any one point. Okay, if students are not very comfortable with the use of technical terminology, don't overface them with trying to get them to learn 28 different words. You actually get further in the long run by being a little bit more modest and saying, okay, well, there's 5 or 6 keywords we're going to really focus upon on this particular lesson next week. Okay, so the focus will shift a little bit from that, because students are likely to find that as being a more manageable way forward. But of course, the other reason why this is really important as well is as a revision aid. You know, that we want students to be able to refer back to this when it comes to an end of topic test or an end of year exam. Okay, practice questions here. What I'd like you to do, please, is to have a look at the now. Okay, I understand this might be a little bit small on your screen, but if you look closely, you can probably see what's going on there. And you can see that what I've done there is to pull out a selection of questions there. Anybody like to have a look at that and to suggest in the chat function what seems to be happening as you run your eye down that list of questions? Okay, what seems to be going on when you go from the questions at the top of the screen to the questions a little bit further down? What are the characteristics here that seem to be in place? have a look to see if you can spot the kind of rubric that we were using, the authors were using on this when they were writing questions that were kind of a little bit further along. Yeah, thank you. So if they are being ranked in difficulty, you're absolutely right. What is making the later ones more difficult? What are the kind of things that are being done in order to make, because you're absolutely right, the one like question 10 is going to be more challenging than question 1. Anybody like to suggest what is making those later questions more difficult? Absolutely right. Lovely. Thanks, Martha. Yes. So when you go down the page there, you can see that the questions will be more open-ended. And that's not by chance. That's absolutely intentional. All of the authors who worked on these books are also very used to the ways that examiners write questions at GCSE. These are not GCSE questions, but they are written very much from the point of view of developing a similar set of skills. So they're more open-ended and less scaffolded. You're absolutely right. So one like question 1 or question 2, question 3, they're closed questions where we're looking for a very specific response. When you get to something like question 9 or question 10, those are more open-ended. So students in that case are going to have to work a little bit harder at those, and they're going to have to come forward to suggest some ideas. And also, the answers are going to be slightly longer ones, so therefore they're going to have to think about how to structure these. I'm sure you can see where this is going. Okay, we're not looking at 6-mark level of response questions, but we are looking at starting to develop those skills. Okay, so this is very much Key Stage 3 as a prequel for GCSE. And really the kind of thing that we were trying to do here was to build a smoother continuum so that students become progressively more challenged as they go through year 7, 8, 9, then into 10 and 11. What we were trying to do here was to reverse engineer from a number of the skills, a number of things that we now know are well-established practice at GCSE, and to say, what does that look like at Key Stage 3? So I hope you can see that the kind of things that are going on here, and this was very much building upon what people were telling us about the important features. It was a mix of, on the one hand, trying to have things here that were eye-catching, that were interesting, that were engaging, that would get students maybe, thinking about what the way in which they might use their science in the future, or some novel context there, but also developing some potentially quite valuable skills and levels of understanding in terms of the ideas that are being presented and the ways that they've got to use those ideas in order to answer these questions. So that ramping of those questions there, and you can see there's some color coding that's running on there, and again that appears right the way through, so that ideas are progressive there. And they use a range of command words. Okay, so it was tier 2 as well as tier 3 vocabulary. That was a very important part of that. What we've also done here is to include a number of worked examples, and not only to put in likely student responses, but also to have some comments about those responses. So you can see here that this particular example that I've picked on here, we've got a couple of students here, Charlotte and Abel. They're trying to decide what kind of cell it is that they're looking at. They've both come forward with ideas and they're asked to suggest who is correct. Now, of course, you can see as a teacher, you could use that in a variety of different ways. Okay, so what you might do, for example, is to put that as a textbook in front of students, or on the other hand, you might not want the students to look directly at the textbook. You might want to use that as an example that you display on the screen, and then get students to comment upon those, and then to share the feedback that comes on it. So the idea of these worked examples can be used in a variety of different ways, and to get students challenged in terms of thinking about what does a high quality answer look like. and to provide teachers with a number of tools they can use in a variety of different ways there. What we're also very keen on doing, and again, we've learned this from other resources that we've worked on as well, is that there's something quite powerful sometimes about putting a response in front of a student that we might then say, so what do you think of this response? Do you think this is a good one? How could you improve it? What is it about this response that we like? And in what way could we strengthen that a little bit? And that throughout the book, there are a number of examples that can be used in a variety of different ways. So there we go. As I said, do please feel free to pitch in any other comments or questions about those different things here. As I said, the kind of process that we used to develop this, as well as it being rigorously based, as you would expect, on the programme of study at Key Stage 3, what we were also doing was identifying key aspects of what it means to be successful in science at 16. Okay, so if you like, what does somebody who has been successful at GCSE, what does that whole package look like? What are the kind of questions that they can answer? What's the kind of vocabulary they can use? And then to reverse engineer this. So we're then saying, right, okay, now some of that development, of course, takes place during Key Stage 4, but it doesn't all happen in Key Stage 4. Some of it needs to happen in Key Stage 3. We don't want Key Stage 3 to be a dry run for GCSE, but we do want it to be the first part of that journey, and we do want it to be developing those skills. So what we then did, having reverse engineered that, is then to say, okay, we've now got a collection of components. We now want to fashion this into a clear and coherent course of study, so that we've got something here that we can put in the hands of teachers, and we can say this kind of thing you can use in a variety of different ways, depending on what it is that your students are capable of doing, whatever it is your students are interested in. That this should, this should achieve a range of different things there. Okay, so that's a bit of a whistle-stop tour, okay, because obviously the development process that goes into books like this is kind of thing that goes on over quite a period of time. But that's a bit of a kind of heads up upon what the key features are and why it is that those came from that. Okay, so any comments or questions? We've got a few minutes left on this, so if there's any comments here or any questions, any points anybody would like to raise, then that's absolutely fine. Please do pitch those in there. You'll also see there that there's a sample there that you can download, and then also find out more about the resources. We've got hyperlinks here in there. And also my email address is there as well. It's edmundwalsh@hotmail.com. So if there are any other points anybody wants to raise, please either do so now, or if there are things that occur to you subsequently, then please do that. Okay, question here from Sophie. Any advice for how to encourage students to pursue careers in science/STEM? That's a really good question. I'm going to pitch in a couple of ideas on this, but I would really like other people to pitch in on this as well. So any examples here of things which you have found successful in terms of encouraging students to pursue careers in STEM? I'm going to pitch in a couple of examples that I've got, but hopefully there will be some others that appear here as well. One of the things that I found to be quite successful, and one of the things I tried doing when I was classroom based, was seeing if I could get an ex-students to come back into school and to do a bit of an input talking about what it was that they were now doing. One of the students who I used on a couple of occasions with this, he was somebody who I taught both at Key Stage 3 and GCSE. He then went on to do A-levels. He then went on to do a degree in science. He then went on to do a PhD at Imperial. And his area of research was in the motion of railways. Right, you probably know, if you're riding on a train, if the train gets up to a certain speed, you sometimes get a rocking motion. And he came in and was talking to students about this rocking motion and how he was involved with researching this. And he was saying to students, a few years back, I was sat where you're sat, okay, and I'm now traveling in a number of different countries. I'm working with a whole range of other STEM professionals, and you could see that there were a number of students that were kind of thinking, oh, wow, okay, so this is somebody who 10 years ago was sat where I am now, and he's now earning a very good living. So if you can get hold of ex-students, it's not always easy, but that was one of the things that I found. Another of the ideas there, STEM ambassadors. I'm a big fan of using STEM ambassadors. Because if you get somebody who's good and the way that they can engage students, then, and if you just Google STEM ambassadors, all parts of the country have people whose job it is to liaise with STEM ambassadors and to suggest who would be useful. Another idea, I was quite fond of gathering video clips of people doing slightly unusual occupations. And one of the ones that was an absolute favorite of mine, it was a video clip. It's easily available on YouTube, and it's to do with service engineers who fly around in helicopters, and they service high voltage power lines whilst the power lines are still in operation. And it's about a 3-minute video, and it starts off with the helicopter flying, and you see them approaching the power line, and the guy sticks out an electrode. You see the sparks flying between the power line and the helicopter, and he then, I kid you not, climbs off the helicopter onto the power line, and he's then going along the power line, making sure that it's all, and the helicopter then flies back up, and he earths the helicopter on this, and then gets back on board the helicopter. And it's about a 3-minute video. So having examples of things like that. And one of the reasons why I quite like doing that is because it was not only getting students thinking about careers, but it was also, I mean, there's some good physics in that. Okay, so you're kind of killing two birds with one stone there. The other example is that sometimes students don't necessarily associate the kind of things that they study in school with some of the careers that are now available. So, for example, you may well know this, that there are more careers now in the UK in the games and video industry than there are in petrochemicals and automotives. It's a huge growth area. And some of those things need people who, for example, have got a really good background in maths and physics. Okay, that there are some computer games that really need people who've got a really good grasp of a number of STEM subjects. And sometimes the students that we teach don't necessarily understand or know about those links. So actually just being able to pop in a couple of other examples, it sometimes gets people to realize, okay, right, if I'm good at this, there's a number of other doors that are opened as well. Now, we've tried to include a number of those in KEYSTONE Science now. We've only got a limited amount of space, and so therefore it's worthwhile researching that on a slightly wider basis as well. But just see if you can find a few unusual examples. Sound engineers, that was another one that I used to use on a couple of occasions. Apologies, those are both a little bit physics-based, but coming up with less common examples, that's going to be the kind of thing there. I don't think there's only one way in which you can get students enthusiastic about that. I think there's a variety of different ways. And if you're approaching those in different ways, it's more likely that you'll get students thinking about things in a different way. Apologies for the length of that answer. That was maybe a slightly longer answer than you were hoping for, but hopefully that will have given you a couple of ideas from that. Are there any other comments or questions before we draw it to a close from that? Okay, so anyway, there we go. So I hope you found that interesting and useful. As I said, my email address is edmundwalsh@hotmail.com. If anybody would like a copy of this presentation, then the good folks at Collins have that available. So if you would like that, then please do avail yourself of that. And also with those hyperlinks there, if you've not come across the materials and you would like samples and to find out more about the course and the way that works, that would be good. So there we go. So the recording is going to go out for anybody. Question there from Martha about the book resources being available in different way. Okay, so I'm going to bounce that one in your direction there, because that's going to be the kind of thing. I'm not ducking this question, Martha. It's a really good question, but it's the people at Collins who will know what the answer to that is. I'm sure that Sarah is furiously typing away there. There we go. Okay, yes, there are ebooks for the student books. Okay, so great question there. So you can make use of those from that. Okay. And there we go. It's available as a complete digital download. So it's not just the various parts, but if there are, and of course, there are quite a few schools now that are looking at, quite a few schools are print-based, but there are some of the schools that are using the materials in various different ways. And right from the word go, of course, when you're writing something like that, that you're writing it in such a way that it can be used in a variety of different ways now. Okay, thank you very much indeed for that. Anything else before we draw things to a close here? Thank you very much indeed for your involvement and participation. Just keeping my eye on the chat window in case there's anything else that comes through on this in the last few minutes that we've got available. Anything else there? I'll work on the assumption of that we've managed to answer all the questions then. I hope you found that interesting and useful. If you've not seen the books, please do explore those. Thank you very much indeed, Kirsten. Good night to you as well. Thank you very much indeed. We'll finish it at that point there. Thank you and goodbye.